अस्सलाम वालेकुम नाज़रीन, आप देख रहे हैं नसीम ज़हरा डेट। बड़ा अहम सब्जेक्ट है और बड़े अहम गेस्ट हैं, यानी कि इनसे बेहतर आपको कोई नहीं बता सकता जो इस वक्त अफ़गानिस्तान में ह्यूमैनिटेरियन सिचुएशन है। अफ़गानिस्तान में आपको मालूम है हमारा हमसाया है और वहाँ से 4 मिलियन रिफ्यूजीज़ अभी पाकिस्तान में हैं और ये बहुत सवाल उठ रहे हैं बार बार कि जी ये और रिफ्यूजीज़ आएंगे अफ़गानिस्तान से, और ये भी सवाल लोग कर रहे हैं कि जी अफ़गानिस्तान से बाहर क्यों निकले, अफ़गानिस्तान के अंदर रहें, वहाँ हालात बेहतर करें। तो जैसे जिसको कह रहे हैं जी पॉलिटिक्स ऑफ रिफ्यूजीज़, वो भी एक बड़ा सवाल है। तो वी हैव विद अस नाज़रीन, हम बड़े खुश हैं कि UNHCR के हाई कमिश्नर मिस्टर फिलिपो ग्रांदी वो हमारे साथ आज मौजूद हैं। और वेलकम टू द शो हाई कमिश्नर। Obviously you haven't followed what I said, but I was just basically saying we've got to talk on a very important topic. As you understand, for Pakistan we've been with the refugee question for the last 40 years, right? And the question now is, what next? We are very concerned about what happens inside Afghanistan because our brothers and sisters live there. We've got shared families, shared blood, shared borders, shared trade, and hence our future is shared also. The question of the refugees, a critical question. Can you explain to us the purpose of your visit briefly to Pakistan?
Well, as you said, this is my 4th visit as High Commissioner for Refugees. The last one was to observe the 40th anniversary of the first influx of refugees. Indeed, a long and complex history. Now the events in Afghanistan prompted this visit. I was actually 3 days in Afghanistan. I went to Kabul, I went to Mazar-e-Sharif, I wanted to see the situation by myself. I wanted to engage with the Taliban by myself to understand better what we need to do, may I say, to prevent a humanitarian and refugee crisis.
High Commissioner, you were looking after Afghanistan when the Taliban were in power. So you are familiar with the Taliban as a government.
I briefly served under their first government, and then I served after the subsequent administration. But I served also, at least briefly, on emergency missions during the Mujahideen. So I think
you
I have seen
a long history of involvement.
Afghanistan in its various phases, and also I have observed different patterns of movement of people over the decades.
So now that you are here in Pakistan, what is UNHCR's expectation of Pakistan?
Look, if you allow me, I will turn the question around. What do we need to do in Afghanistan to prevent this crisis from happening? I think it is still possible. The humanitarian situation is bad, very bad. But I think we still have a window of time to intervene and try to address it, to resolve it.
May I just ask you that the humanitarian crisis which we speak of did not begin on the 15th of August. Isn't it a few years old?
Absolutely, because insecurity has made it very difficult to address some of the humanitarian challenges. Now, one thing that has perhaps changed now in Afghanistan, although the situation is very fragile and fluid, is that there is more security. Because the main reason of security, fighting between the Taliban and the previous government, has gone. So I think we have an opportunity now to scale up, and we will do that. We are doing that. And try to address, for example, the massive issue of internal displacement. 3.5 million people displaced. They need food, they need shelter, they need medicines. And I think we are doing that. My visit is part of an effort to do that.
Okay, so they're displaced because?
Those 3.5 million were displaced because of conflict.
Also, when I read up on it, they say that because of famine, because of agriculture issues there, and so people have migrated from rural areas to urban. So it's a combination of factors.
It's a combination of factors. I'm referring to those that are more likely to return to their homes if there is security. So we have to start working from that. In my discussions with the various Taliban interim ministers, they have, first of all, said humanitarian operations will be secured, will provide. We want them to happen. We want organizations to work here, and we want displaced people to return home. Look, it won't solve all the problems, but this is a good start. And I think we have to take them on their word, work with them. We are humanitarians. This is not recognition. This is not political. Work with them in order to try and start addressing this problem.
So you're saying that there's, they want to work. They're saying, come and work. We're not really, it's not about politics. It's about humanitarian. So you feel confident that, that you will be able to work with them. And the other thing is, first, just on, you feel confident that you can work with them?
Confident is a big word in such a fluid situation, but I'm hopeful that we can. But you
look very confident. and then you've been going back and forth and you have been engaging with them.
Yeah, and I think...
and you have experience also.
I think there is a big need. They recognize that. They know they cannot address this alone.
Some credibility with them also, High Commissioner, because I mean, if they're engaging...
I don't know about myself, but UNHCR is well known. Every Afghan knows UNHCR because, unfortunately, so many have been refugees.
Yeah. Also, and if I may, it seems like there's a sudden kind of panic and like a sudden problem has emerged and a renewed energy, although, as you yourself said, there was no fighting that took place. There was fear, and I was reading somewhere that since January, 7,000 are wanting to migrate refugees to the EU, etc. So why the sudden kind of...
Well, of course, the situation has undergone such a change that nobody expected, that everybody gets anxious. However, may I say something? There are other risks. To me, the biggest one at the moment is an implosion of Afghanistan. Because even if we bring humanitarian resources, there are bigger issues to be resolved. Who will pay the salaries in the health sector, for example, now that all international development assistance has been frozen? Now, I don't have a reply to that. These issues are linked to politics, of course. My recommendation to the international community, as a humanitarian, as a refugee official, is if you want to avoid much bigger problems, you have to resolve those issues one way or the other. You have to resolve, we have to find ways to support the Afghan state in its basic services, distributing food, education, health, and so forth. Otherwise, the risk of a much bigger crisis further down the line is really, really there.
High Commissioner, but this is a problem that has been there through the Ghani government as well. And I mean, if you look at what for example, US is saying, US officials, US Marine Corps, and etc., and the journalists, that it was a disaster, the governance. There was corruption. I'm not saying it. I mean, there are editorial New York Times article by their editorial person, Farah Stockfield or whatever. I mean, they write it in detail. So what I'm saying, you're dealing with a problem. It's a humanitarian problem, and as you said, delivery of services, etc. But it's a cumulative thing. It hasn't just started.
Yeah, and now with the old government, international assistance could be deployed. Now, other problems existed. I don't want to go back to the past. This is not...
So that's a critical difference that
of course.
They don't want to give the money.
Now, the problem is, in order for the donors, Western donors in particular, to support Afghanistan, they have to deal with whoever controls Afghanistan. In this case, is the Taliban. And then many complex political issues come up: recognition, legitimacy, etc., etc. Now, what my humble advice as a humanitarian worker to all these parties, to the Taliban, to the international communities, there are many issues to be sorted out. For example, will women be allowed to work? Will girls be allowed to go to school? Will minorities be treated fairly? These were problematic issues back in the first Taliban government. I think the international community will want to see some clarity there from the Taliban. And my advice to both is have a dialogue on these issues and find a way forward. It may need compromises on both sides. It may need some gradual work on these important issues, but it is important that that dialogue occurs. If there is a breakdown, if Afghanistan is left alone, then we're in trouble.
Well, I think that if you look at the neighbors, I mean, neighbors, extended neighbors, 8 countries around Afghanistan, all of them are engaging: China, Russia, Tajikistan, Uzbekistan, Pakistan, Iran, Turkey, and they realize that while humanitarian aid is important, human rights issues, etc., have to be addressed. So it has to go hand in hand. But you just said that the international community and the Western world and the EU, I mean US and EU specifically, they have been talking about, they've felt very sad and whatever about what the people of Afghanistan are going through, and yet the US has frozen their accounts, and yet IMF is saying, yesterday they said that it's a huge crisis, financial crisis, and yet they're not giving money. So how are you addressing that? Because it's directly linked to what happens finally in terms of the humanitarian crisis.
I personally, and heads of organizations like mine, can do only a little bit.
Of course.
We can bridge the gap at the beginning, and we'll find ways to bridge it as much as possible. But there is not an enormous amount of time before these problems are addressed. I don't have an answer, but I know that the answer to this lies in dialogue between the international community and the Taliban. There's no plan B here. It's either that or we have a problem.
Yeah, but, I mean, which is what we saw in 96 to 2001. You really had that problem. So surely you're right, you can't do anything about it, but it's so deeply linked to the problem that you're wanting to solve that inevitably this is something you have to keep addressing.
No, you're right. You're right. And here I have 2 comments. First, that stability, the functioning of Afghanistan are absolutely important. So are these human rights issues. So I think that in this dialogue, there has to be a point of meeting on these matters. And I think it is possible to do it. All my life I have devoted to negotiating these issues, and I know it is possible to do it. The other thing is, because this may take some time, politics are complicated around this issue. I think that everybody has the full commitment of the humanitarians like us that we will try to do a maximum. But nobody should think that humanitarian assistance will save the country alone. That can help for a few months, but not beyond that.
Not beyond that. We'll take a break. नाज़रीन, ब्रेक लेते हैं, गुफ्तगू को जारी रखते हैं और फिर इस पर बात करेंगे कि मग़रबी ममालिक वगैरह आखिर करेंगे क्या, कैसे करेंगे, उस सवाल को छोड़ा नहीं जा सकता. After the break, stay with us. वेलकम बैक नाज़रीन. हमारे साथ UNHCR के हाई कमिश्नर साहब हैं और उनसे हम बात कर रहे हैं कि किस तरह वो देख रहे हैं दुनिया की सूरत हाल. ये आपको बताते चलें कि ये बड़े इन्वॉल्व रहे हैं, अफ़गानिस्तान में भी ये काम करते रहे हैं, अफ़गानिस्तान से डील करते रहे हैं, और UNHCR में एज हाई कमिश्नर इनका ये सेकंड जो है टर्म है. ओके, सो जस्ट कमिंग बैक टू द क्वेश्चन ऑफ the politics and non-recognition and cutting off aid, etc. Up until now, we've seen and we've been following your movements, what you've been doing, your meetings, where you're going, for the last so many days, several weeks. What is your hope as far as let's start with the EU. EU is concerned. The recognition isn't there, but how much humanitarian aid are they willing to give, and how far can they go without recognition?
I think humanitarian aid is not a problem. Now, the problem is more financial. How much aid will be available? Yeah. That I don't know, but you've seen the conference on Monday. Yeah, the Secretary General called. Yeah. 1.2 billion. We have to see what of that money is new, what is already there, but the analysis we've had so far is pretty good. I think that we've got a good response, and this is only for 3 months. So I think that here, in a situation like this, the issue is not financial, not yet. It may be if the situation is protracted, but not yet. So like I said, there's more complicated issues that need to be addressed.
Okay, so let's look at the 3 months from now to 3 months down the road. Medicines, food, money for shelter. So how is this, where do you come in the picture? You've got FAO, yourselves, UNICEF, etc.?
I think it was a very good decision by all of us in the UN. All of the UN leaders decided on the 15th of August that we would not leave, that we would stay in Afghanistan. Everybody else left. Most, not all.
Not Pakistan.
Most, not Pakistan, not Qatar, not Russia, Turkey, China, but most of other missions left, but we stayed. And we thought that it was important to stay. It was a little bit scary in the beginning when the attack happened at the airport, but I think it was a wise decision. That gives us a good head start to now scale up the operation. And don't forget, we all have a big infrastructure in Afghanistan. We have offices, we have staff, we have a network of partners, Afghan organizations in particular. And I think that this will not be a problem to scale up once we can bring back the full complement, and we're already doing it.
Can you tell us about the structure that you have in place, and how is it working or not working after August 15?
What was difficult about August 15 was that we had to reduce, and we were uncertain about security in the country. You appreciate. It was such a surprise, such a sudden event that we had to pause, we had to reduce. But I have to tell you, we never even stopped distributing relief items, for example, in our case, UNHCR, to the displaced people. So, sometimes the public underestimates how much humanitarians can do under duress. We work in Yemen, we work in Syria, we work in Libya, we work in very tough places. So we are quite used to that, and we continue to do it, but on a smaller scale. Now, I must say, and I saw it by myself, I went to Mazar-e-Sharif on purpose. I wanted to go out of Kabul. There is more security. We will have probably more access than we had before the 15th of August. So it's a good window to scale up, for example, preparations for winter, which are very urgent. We have basically a month or two of window before it becomes really bad in Afghanistan.
So your offices are working, your people are delivering services, there are men and women in your team. How is the local situation? Do they feel more secure or insecure? How are the Taliban administration engaging with them? I think people would like to hear you talk about it, because obviously there are so many stories about how it was and will be.
First of all, remember that during the last couple of years, during the fighting between Taliban and the previous government, we were already working in Taliban-controlled areas. So this is not
70%.
Completely new for us. Again, no politics, so we can go to these areas. So we've developed quite a lot of experience already working with them, but it's very diverse. It's not homogeneous. In some places they are more in control, in other places they just came more recently, they're still establishing their chains of command. It's quite complex. Afghanistan is very big. So there is no single answer to your question. It's very uneven. But you raised a very important point. We work with men and women. Afghan men and Afghan women are part of our workforce. So an important question I asked the Taliban is, please allow women to work. In certain sectors, they're indispensable, especially in our type of work, where you need to deal with people, including other women.
And gain access to women to give them service.
Gain access to women. It's only women in many parts of Afghanistan that can do that. And I think this type of reasoning, which is not theoretical, it's practical, is a useful way to start a dialogue with them. You see what I mean?
So what was their response?
Positive, I would say. Then I went back to our women colleagues and said, how do you feel? They feel still a bit uncertain.
Yeah, naturally.
But look, the day before yesterday, the first women went back to our office in Kabul to start working. So it's a good sign. First women, not all of them. We leave it free, we leave it spontaneous. Some of them are still working from home. We've learned to work from home because of COVID, so we can apply this to...
They work from home.
Exactly.
Yes.
So I think it will be gradual. I think we should not rush. But I think it's a very good test of cooperation, and I think it's one which they will understand. It's an important one.
Since, High Commissioner, I guess we can't emphasize it enough, that since the political climate and the political relationship between the Taliban and EU and US, etc., is so critical in terms of humanitarian, Hence, I will have to ask you this question, that when you talk to the people, whether it's US, EU, other Western countries, and one of their main concerns is, of course, human rights should be in place, which is everybody's concern, but it's a question only of whether it will be gradual, or in Arabic there's this term kun fayakun, that you say and it happens. So I mean, it's not going to be instant. How are you seeing them be more responsive compared to the 90s? Do they understand that this is a bit about process also?
Look, I don't want anybody to accuse me of being naive. I've been enough in these situations to know that things are complicated.
Yeah.
And the other consideration to put forward is that even in my short interaction with these authorities, you can see they're very different. This is not a very homogeneous group. And like in Kabul, the Taliban, etc. So, there will be probably different interlocutors with different points of view. I hope that those that are moderate, those that understand the importance of these issues will be strong and will be able to have their point of view prevail. And by the way, I can say that I have asked Pakistan to help us in this direction. Pakistan has obviously an important line and influence, and I have asked the same to Qatar, for example, and to other countries in the region that have influence. It's very important that we all cooperate in this direction in the interest of stability.
I was talking about the attitude of the Western countries when you talk to them about, but you gave the attitude about the Taliban, which is equally important, but anyway.
And I think that this also somehow answers your other question. Of course, we need to be gradual. This will be a process of negotiations. And I think that everybody will have to try to understand the other people's point of view and adapt and maybe make some compromise. Of course, there are some fundamental issues. We absolutely should not want the Taliban to go back to some of the excesses we saw in the past. You remember them very well.
But
because that will be really bad for the Afghan people.
But do you see that happening?
No, we haven't seen this happening, but it is important that this doesn't happen. Because that would break down any possible compromise, and then the situation will be...
Yeah, in terms of how they're approaching everything, it seems that they understand that, but for how long, I think that's the big question. So, as we kind of move ahead, in terms of humanitarian aid, are we sure that the people of Afghanistan in the next 3-4 months will not be facing starvation, will not be facing... Is there enough coming in? I mean, I know that in Pakistan, people who are looking after this, they're saying you ask one company, there are 30 companies here willing to send support and aid.
I can't give you a definitive answer because, of course, the challenges are enormous and we have little time, as I said, to meet them. But I think we're capable of doing it. I think the resources we got on Monday will be immensely useful, and we have to simply make it work. I think it's possible. Like I said, the positive thing in all this is that we have access. We probably have access. Now, we've been told we'll have access anywhere throughout the country, and that we will have access to all ethnic groups in every location. This is also an important ask that we're making to the Taliban. We cannot distribute to one group and not to the other. So I think it's important to build on this. But we have more access here than in northern Ethiopia, for example. So I think that the problems we meet there, that we have a humanitarian crisis because of lack of access, I don't see them potentially here. Unless, of course, and God forbid, there is again a deterioration of the security situation. I cannot exclude that completely. We don't know how homogeneous or not is this group. If the group disgregates and starts fighting, we've seen some reports in the press, I can't confirm one way. That's dangerous, of course.
Although political differences will happen in groups.
Political differences are fine. If they translate into violence, it's not fine.
Before we take a break, I again want to take you back to the Taliban and the administration and so on. So one of the things that obviously has fascinated people and people have been wondering is, what is this? An army dissolves into nothingness. these people come, take over, and then suddenly you hear the Taliban are all over the country and they're running the country and there's the administration, as if there's some kind of magic overnight wand that was waved. So tell us a little bit, because you have first-hand experience, because your organization, as you told us, has been working this. So how has this happened? Just how do you understand it?
This is a difficult question. I'm not a political analyst.
No, I want you to just tell us how
but I'm telling you, I'm not a political analyst.
I don't want political
and I think that you can expect that there will be millions of studies about this issue that will come up by much more experienced people than me. However, when I lived there in the beginning of this government, in the first years, which were very positive, as you remember, 2002, 3, 4. And one observation I had, I left Afghanistan after 4 years. I lived in the center of Kabul.
Really?
In the most privileged area of the country, right? The center of the capital. I still didn't have proper electricity. I still didn't have proper services. I can just imagine in rural areas, in remote areas, how this must have felt. So, the dividend of peace and stability that was the promise of 2001-2 didn't reach millions of people.
It didn't.
And you cannot build consensus without that dividend being equally shared by a larger part of the population. And perhaps this was one of the problems that caused this upheaval.
That's what everybody, even the Americans, are saying that. We'll take a break. नाज़रीन ब्रेक लेते हैं, ब्रेक के बाद आएंगे, फिर हम बात करेंगे पाकिस्तान के बारे में. पाकिस्तान के, अफ़गानिस्तान के रेफ्यूजीज़, पाकिस्तान का रिस्पॉन्स क्या रहा है, दुनिया के मुकाबले में पाकिस्तान ने कैसे इसको संभाला. एक ऐसी चीज़ है, एक ऐसा इशू है जिस पे कि हमें फ़ख्र होना चाहिए. ब्रेक लेते हैं, स्टे विद अस. वेलकम बैक नाज़रीन. हमारे साथ UNHCR के हाई कमिश्नर बड़े हमारे एक अहम गेस्ट हैं, और अब हम उनसे बात करते हैं पाकिस्तान के बारे में. 40 साल से हमारे पास रिफ्यूजीज़ हैं. दुनिया कैसे देखती है और क्या तवक्कुआत हैं. सो लेट्स नाउ टॉक अबाउट exclusively about Pakistan and relationship in terms of UNHCR and the refugees, etc. Often, some sections within Pakistan are critical and they say, look, we're not doing enough. Others say, well, we're doing what we can do, and if you compare it globally, we've, as far as Afghanistan is concerned, we've really been hosting a spectacular number.
True. I agree with those that say that you have done more than the average in the international community. Look at Europe, that is pushing back a smaller number of refugees. You've hosted, I always say, not only you have hosted millions, you have hosted generations of Afghan refugees since 1979, 1980. And may I say, UNHCR has been with you throughout this time. But unlike the first years when there was an outpouring of resources and solidarity, that has declined.
We've dealt with it greatly ourselves. UNHCR has always come with its appreciation and support where it can give. And the discussion now about Pakistan allowing refugees to come through the borders if there's any need, and I've heard you say several places that you don't see any amassing of Afghans at the borders, so you don't have a sense of people wanting to rush into Pakistan. But also Pakistan's position now that we must make sure that humanitarian support is provided within, so that the crisis doesn't become an external crisis. So there is a role that Pakistan is also trying to play in terms of humanitarian in a big way inside Afghanistan. Tell us about that role.
I actually agree with that. I think that preventing a crisis is the key issue now. And I'm very grateful, and I said this in my meetings with the government yesterday, very grateful that Pakistan is sending humanitarian assistance and facilitating. This will be very
That's
important.
what I was going to ask.
Facilitating, the facilitate passage of cargo. I was in Kabul. I waited on purpose for this convoy to come. It was coming from Pakistan through Torkham, Jalalabad, and Kabul. And I think this is very positive, and it will continue to be needed because we need to really put massive effort into the country to address the current humanitarian crisis. My concern is, of course, if there is a social and economic meltdown, services, if there is infighting between the Taliban, further insecurity, this may cause different type of movements. And those may try to reach the border, but let's hope it doesn't happen.
High Commissioner, whether this, God forbid, turns into a different kind of refugee crisis, the attitude of the Western world is going to be very critical in influencing that also. Because if there is no aid coming, if there is negativity, and also, I mean, I'll come to the airport incident, which I think was really...
But you know, it's a bit like I said before. First of all, let me preface this. I really hope this doesn't happen.
Of course.
I don't want anybody to think that because I'm the High Commissioner for Refugees, I hope there is a refugee crisis. Of course, refugee crisis is bad for the refugees themselves. It shouldn't happen. But should, God forbid, happen, I think that aid will come at this particular point. You know, humanitarian emergencies, visible one, attract resources. The problem is always the medium and long term when this declines, if you see what I mean. So we really need to be very careful about managing this, preparing this. But like I said, let's prevent more than anything else.
Yes, I think Pakistan is not looking for resources right now. Pakistan is, because you know that refugees is not just money. Refugees is, I mean, it affects your entire life. Nobody knows that better than Pakistan. And so it's I think that the fact that we've got a neighborhood group that has been put together, fighting terrorism, making sure that, you know, that issue is taken care of, improving economic security interaction.
But can I interrupt you a bit on that? Because I think we all agree that humanitarian assistance to the existing, you know, there's 3 million Afghans here, 1.5 million almost registered and many other unregistered.
Yeah, 3 million.
I keep telling donors, even if there is no major influx, can we please do a bit more for the people that are already here? But, you know, there are initiatives. The government of Pakistan and the World Bank, for example, have signed last year, I think, or earlier this year, an agreement for more than $300 million to help not only Afghans in Balochistan, in Peshawar and surrounding areas, but also local communities. And you know, World Bank assistance is not like UNHCR assistance. It goes through the state and it benefits local health structures, education structures. So there are efforts that we have been making and that will continue. We should not also ignore completely that part of the system.
Yeah, sure. And I mean, Pakistan has now been saying for several years that, you know, create the attraction within Afghanistan so that the refugees go back. But as we now hear from the West and from the US and all these reports coming out, now they are telling us how terrible the government was. I mean, I'm just saying, they're saying how deadly, disastrous. In fact, one of the, at one of the hearings, I think Admiral Mullen was asked, so the corruption was so bad, and one of the senators was saying, Congressman, Senator, that it's so bad that if he sent even 1 million strong army to fight the Taliban, we would have failed because the corruption is so bad. He said yes. So what I'm saying is that the situation there was so bad that things obviously, you know, was never going to create an environment where the refugees want to go back, but we are hoping that you know, things improve. Well, before we conclude, as a High Commissioner of Refugees, who has an amazing track record, being a compassionate person, very engaged, involved, etc. This whole question of people getting onto a plane and wanting to leave, you know, the airport scene. But I just want to ask you this, and I think one of the Taliban spokesperson or somebody said this, and I heard several people repeat that. High Commissioner, how wise is it to announce, okay, we will take you with us, come without even documents? And I mean, this was a recipe for instant chaos.
You know, I don't want to comment on that. This was an operation, this, let's call it evacuation, which we did not participating.
No, you were not.
It was bilateral, it was states that did it, and then they asked help from other states. Now, I think that the main focus for these states was to extract people that had been associated with them, one way or the other. Now, of course, it was done in a very quick way, rather chaotic, as we have seen, and inevitably there's been some very bad occurrences that have happened during that operation. It's over now. It's practically over now. But I want to make a related point, since you said that I have a track record and I'm a compassionate person. You know, like we said, there's no massive influx into any of the neighboring countries at the moment. But there is a trickle of people. First of all, there is movement of people, as there is always. If you go to Torkham and Chaman, many people know, there's always traffic. That's regular traffic. Now, among the people that are coming in...
Drastically cut down right now. They're 20,000 normally. There are a few hundred. Yeah. Trade is going on, but otherwise individuals...
But among the people coming in, we have observed, there may be people that have some genuine reason to be afraid.
Illness.
Sickness, belonging to some minorities that, you know, have a very bad experience in the past. So what I told the government yesterday is, let's be compassionate to these people. This is not like managing a big flow. These are individual.
And has been very compassionate.
But that's exactly what I mean. Continue to be compassionate.
Yeah, no, what I'm saying is first plane load of Afghans who came in to Pakistan, flown in on the 15th of August, High Commissioner, were all the opposition members, opposition to the Taliban. So, I mean, Pakistan has created mistakes in the past, has committed mistakes, but certainly has been
fully recognize. My point is that those people came out with planes because they had the means to escape, they had connection. The people I'm talking about have no connections. And they've made it themselves to the border, and they're trying to...
Also, I mean, ultimately we have to make sure that the Taliban should run the country in a
way that doesn't cause this problem.
Yeah, and also, as we always say, that we should, when we talk about rule of law and compassion and human rights, then we should talk about, you won't, but I would talk about Palestine and Kashmir also, because you can't be moral by half, right? We have to look at the entire world. Thank you so much, High Commissioner, for talking to me. It was a pleasure to have you on the show.
Thank you very much for having me on the show.
बहुत शुक्रिया नाज़रीन, इसी पर ख़त्म करते हैं। आपने सुना है कमिश्नर साहब ने पाकिस्तान के बारे में बात की और बड़ी तफसील में जो अफ़गानिस्तान में सूरत हाल है, और इनकी बात सुनना इसलिए लाजमी था क्योंकि ये 20 साल से 20 भी नहीं 30 साल से अफ़गानिस्तान को बड़े करीब से जानते हैं, इनका तजुर्बा भी वहाँ है। तो हमारी तरफ से जितना ही, खुदा हाफ़िज़। पाकिस्तान जिंदाबाद।